The world of the 2060s was grappling with a horrific energy crisis as natural resources started to dwindle and the major superpowers of the world found themselves in increasingly desperate situations. This often led these superpowers to large-scale wars, including a major war between Europe and the Middle East happening in the 2050s. Yet no war in world history would have quite the impact that the Sino-American War would have. With the natural resources located within the People's Republic of China having run out in the 2050s, the Chinese began looking for other alternatives. Similar situations were happening across the world, however, one nation was spared the energy crisis, the United States of America, being lucky enough to have found some of the last oil reserves on the planet underneath Alaska. This spearheaded a series of large infrastructure plans to extract and utilize the oil, including a major pipeline running from Alaska to the mainland United States. Realizing that their nation's ability to function would be seriously hampered by the loss of natural resources, the Chinese hatched a plan. They would seize Alaska. Meanwhile, in the United States, the American forces began hunkering down to defend the last natural resources on the planet. The objectives of the Americans in the coming war would simply be to maintain control of their oil resources in Alaska, and eventually to do a similar amount of damage to the People's Republic of China. Meanwhile, the People's Liberation Army, and to a larger extent, the People's Republic of China, sought to seize the oil resources in Alaska and claim the last remnants of Earth's oil for their own industrial apparatus. The invasion of Alaska began in the winter of 2066 when Chinese airborne forces dropped around the city of Anchorage. This assault, combined with a naval assault and a large naval blockade of the region, quickly isolated the American defensive forces there and left them stunned and disorganized in the face of a massive Chinese invasion, which quickly grabbed ground in Alaska. Fearing that Alaska would be overrun and the infrastructure that carries oil to the United States was now under threat, the Americans began putting pressure on Canada, attempting to get Canada to allow American forces onto their soil to guard the strategic pipeline that connected the United States with Alaska. Furthermore, the United States was finding it increasingly difficult to resupply their forces now fighting a battle in Alaska, as any U.S. shipping going up and down the Pacific coast was a target for the large Chinese submarine force. In 2067, the Canadian government relented, allowing U.S. forces to use Canadian soil to transfer troops to Alaska, as well as to set up defensive positions along the oil pipeline. Meanwhile, seeing the importance of new military technology in the growing conflict, United States officials ordered the development of newer forms of weapons, most notably power armor, to augment their armored forces. As the fighting in Alaska became more and more intense and U.S. forces became a more and more present element within Canadian territory, this began to raise tensions in between the Canadian people and the military of the United States, which was now putting more and more effort into attempting to reclaim their lost territory in Alaska. This led to widespread protests, mainly across the western half of Canada, but realistically all across the nation, to the presence of U.S. military forces. At first, these protests were ignored, but increasingly they became a problem for U.S. military operations, and thus U.S. military forces began actively responding to Canadian protesters. At the same time, American power armor was arriving for the first time in Alaska, evening the playing field in between American forces defending ground there and the advancing Chinese tanks and infantry. This led to the battle breaking down into what was more or less a stalemate, fairly similar to the trench warfare seen during the First World War, the harsh Alaskan winter making it that much more inhospitable. Eventually, the increasing logistic demands of the ongoing war in Alaska and the ever-growing civil unrest in Canada culminated in the United States being forced to annex Canada on June 3rd of 2072. With Canada now being formally American territory, American troops were able to operate freely on Canadian soil. This meant heavy American units could more easily access Alaska. Seeing this as an imminent threat to their ongoing war effort, the Chinese began deploying biological weapons against the American troops. In response, the United States ordered their already nationalized company Westech to begin developing a biological weapon of their own. This biological weapon would eventually become known as the Forced Evolutionary Virus, and while it wouldn't really be deployed in wartime, it would become a problem in the post-war world. And the stalemate continued to drag on into 2074 when the Americans, hoping to alleviate some of the pressure on the defensive forces in Alaska, mounted a large invasion of mainland China. The intention of this invasion was to draw the Chinese attention away from their invasion of Alaska and to the defense of their homeland. However, initially this invasion was ultimately not a success. While American troops were able to seize several key beachheads, advancing further north became a challenge. Most notably, Chinese defenses around the city of Shanghai put up a significantly stiff resistance. While the American forces continued what would become known as the Yangtze Campaign, their push through Shanghai with the intention of driving forward towards Beijing, a second invasion was carried out in the Gobi Desert. However, it's not really clear how these troops got there. The assumption would be airborne forces and deep infiltration forces, but it's not entirely certain. It's around this time that information about Chinese stealth technology began making its way to the Americans, most notably the advancements in stealth armor that had been developed for individual armor for soldiers, and a fleet of stealth submarines that could be used to carry out surprise attacks against the United States. It's around this time that the United States began deploying their second model of power armor, the T-51 power armor, which made its first appearance in June of 2076. Throughout 2076 and early 2077, the Americans began carrying out a series of campaigns with the intention of cutting off supplies to Chinese forces in Alaska. Most notably, these included naval campaigns with the intention of sinking or seizing Chinese shipping that linked the troops in Alaska to the Chinese mainland. And in early 2077, these came to a successful conclusion, with American forces beginning to carry out massive counterstrikes in Alaska, ultimately resulting in the reclamation of Anchorage and the liberation of Alaska from the Chinese occupation forces. With Alaska now under American control, the focus pivoted to the American campaigns in the Chinese mainland. It's also worth noting that at this time, American forces are now fighting significant resistance movements in occupied Canada, meaning that this still is a two-front war. But with the reinvigoration of American troops following the victories in Alaska, American troops now began advancing northward, pushing through Shanghai, and advancing towards Beijing. The end was clearly at hand. American leadership made their way to the bunkers, fearing a Chinese last-ditch nuclear strike. Meanwhile, with increasing civil unrest on the home front this time, American forces that had been deployed in Alaska were redeployed to the streets of the United States as a state of martial law is declared across America. On October 23rd, 2077, the first sightings of Chinese nuclear subs off the west coast of the United States are observed by American naval forces. Shortly thereafter, Chinese bombers are spotted over Alaska, and by 9 in the morning, it was clear that a Chinese nuclear strike was underway. Seeing the fall of Beijing as imminent, with American forces nearing the outskirts of the city, the Chinese government has ordered the launch of all of their nuclear arsenal. With a large number of ICBMs launched in the 9 o'clock hour on the morning of October 23rd, 2077, the United States was left with no other option but to retaliate with a similar or greater amount of force. Over the next 2 hours, the entire globe was showered with nuclear fire and radiation as all major nuclear powers exchanged whatever nuclear weapons they had in their arsenal. This resulted in an event known as the Great War, the final fiery end of the Sino-American War, and the real lasting legacy this conflict had on the globe as a whole. Unlike most episodes of Battle Analysis where we can declare a winner, there is no winner in the Great War. The Sino-American War ended with a defeat for all of mankind. And while humanity survived the Sino-American War and the nuclear fallout that would follow its horrific conclusion, it only came to prove one true thing about human nature. War is in our blood, and war never changes. The Sino-American War was most notable for the Great War, the nuclear exchange that marked its conclusion. However, the nuclear weapons deployed by both sides during the Great War are very different from the nuclear weapons we have here in real life. If you'd like to learn more about the differences between Fallout's nuclear weapons and real-world nuclear weapons, I'll leave a link in the upper right-hand corner to a video on that. And if you have any other battles you'd like to see covered in future episodes of Battle Analysis, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.